like to talk about tonight is ideals and standards, how they're different, and how one uses them in guiding one's personal growth. On the surface, it's very easy to describe the difference. A standard is something that's binding on me now, something I have to do. If I violate a standard, I'm in a standard of my own, that I've failed. I'm guilty. An ideal is something that you want to grow towards, want to become more like. Indeed, some say that if you've achieved your ideals, get new ideals. Ideal is not supposed to be something you have in your pocket. Ideal is something that's supposed to be beyond you, and something that inspires you to grow in that direction. The trouble is there's a problem which muddies the waters, which makes it not obvious that what I've said is right or even coherent. It's a well-known philosophical problem, and I'd like to describe it to you and describe what I think the solution is. Not only I, but there's one school of thought like this. I think it's the Jewish school of thought. I'll show you why it's a Jewish school of thought. And then, when we've got that out of the way, hopefully we're on the same page, then I'll come back and talk about ideals and standards in the light of the solution to that problem, and also how we apply them in practical terms. There are 613 commandments. What is it that I am obligated to do? Am I obligated to fulfill all of them? Okay, all of the ones that apply to me. Am I obligated to fulfill them all? There are two standard objections to that idea, even though I would have thought so. God commanded them. And there are two variations on the same idea. One is, suppose it's impossible for me to fulfill all of them. I just can't. I haven't got the time, the strength, the knowledge, the resources. I just can't do it. And the other half of the thought is, really, all I can do is try my best. That's all I can do. So really, what we ought to say is, I'm obligated to try my best. To go beyond that and say, you're not only obligated to try your best, you have to also succeed, seems to be unreasonable. And indeed, a very famous philosopher named Immanuel Kant had this as a fundamental principle of his philosophy. To say that you ought to do something assumes that you're able to do it. If you aren't able to do it, there's no point in telling you that you have to do it, you ought to do it. You must do it because it's idle, because you can't do it. The slogan in philosophy is, ought implies can. You can only say somebody ought to do something when you have in your pocket that he can do it. If it's not true that he can do it, then it's not true that he ought to do it. Ought implies can. That was an axiom of Kant's moral philosophy. And most people hearing it first time, I think, find it to be quite obvious. Nevertheless, there's another view. Maybe that's wrong. Maybe you ought to do it even if you can't. Why does that sound crazy? I'll tell you why it sounds crazy. Because you say to the person, you ought to X. And he says, but I can't. I can't do it. It's impossible. It's beyond me. We don't want to blame him. We don't want to penalize him. We don't want to hold him responsible for not doing X. According to this second point of view, that's really what bothers us. It seems to be grossly unjust to say, you ought to do X, you didn't do X, I'm going to punish you, even though you couldn't have done it. The fact that he couldn't have done it means that he shouldn't be blamed and he shouldn't be punished. But maybe that's all it means. Maybe that all it means is that when you don't fulfill your obligations because you couldn't, you shouldn't be blamed and punished. Must we go on further and say, and furthermore, you didn't have an obligation in the first place? That's not obvious. So here's the second position. You are obligated to do all the things that are right, good, and morally binding. If you fail because you can't, then there's no penalty. But that doesn't mean that you're free from the obligation. You think of the 613 commandments, we are obligated to do all of them. We ought to do all of them perfectly. It's just that when I can't do one or another or some in combination, then I'm not subject to penalty. The Gemara puts it this way: onus rachmana patrei, a person who's in a position beyond his control, God frees him from, patrei is to be freed from, and then the commentators fill in, frees him from onish, from punishment. That doesn't mean he's not obligated. According to this picture, he is obligated. Just pays no penalty for failure.
Does that mean what you can't do, you shouldn't do?
No. What we're saying here is that if I can't do it, maybe I still should do it. Even if I can't do it, I should do it.
What, challenge yourself?
Sorry?
Challenge yourself or something like that?
No. You're speaking for the first point of view. If I tell you you should do it, and it's impossible for you, that's just dumb. It's just pointless. It's just hopeless. I mean, how can I tell you should do something that you can't do? That was the first point of view.
Who used to tell me that I should do something? Do you know what I mean?
Sorry?
Like that kind of thing where...
No. I'm talking about your own values. I'm not talking about imposing values on somebody else. You recognize for yourself that these are things that are important. Now, should you say to yourself, well, I think that X is important, but since I'm not able to do X, I don't really have any obligation to do X?
If you don't find it important, you should still do it, isn't it?
No. I'm not saying anything about that. Someone's dying. Is it important to save his life?
Yeah.
For sure. Suppose he's too far away from me. He's just too far away. I can't get there in time. Does that mean now it's not important to save his life? Sure, it's important to save his life. I just can't do anything about it. Do I have an obligation to save his life? So there are two ways to say it. No, of course not. You can't get there, so you can't be obligated to do it. That's one way to say it. The other way to say it is, of course you have an obligation to save him.
But you can't do it.
You can't do it, so you're not penalized for not living up to your obligation. You're not penalized.
As long as the intention is there, yeah.
But, it's funny to talk about an intention to do something I know I can't do. That sounds idle. It sounds a little psychologically mixed up. But I'm recognized as an obligation to do it.
Yeah.
It's just that it's beyond my ability to do it. Now, if you consider these two possibilities, in the Talmud, if you had to face a question like that, the immediate question would be, L'may nafka mina? What practical difference does it make if we say it one way or the other? If you can't think of a practical difference that it would make, then there's a suspicion that it's just talk. They're not real concepts behind it, because it can't make any difference what you do. So the question will be, what difference does it make if I say it one way or the other? I think there is a difference. I think the difference applies specifically to Jewish law. But let me give you a simple example, and then perhaps I'll give you some examples from Jewish law as well. Richard borrowed money from Paul. Now, when he borrowed the money, he had assets, and he had a good job, and he was healthy, and there was absolutely no reason to suspect he would have trouble paying it back. He borrowed the money in good faith, and he signed a document. He'll pay it all back by June 1st. That was in July. That was in September. But then things started to go wrong. His house burned down, and he contracted emphysema, and one of his parents died, and his other parent is dependent upon him. And he ends up with no resources and no ability to make money. Comes June 1st, and he just can't do it. He can't do it. It's impossible for him to do it. Let's try out these 2 points of view on this case. The first point of view says, well, if he can't do it, he has no obligation to do it. You can't say that he ought to do it because he can't do it. There's no point in saying you ought to do things that you can't do. So, at least as long as he has no resources to pay the money back, he has no obligation to pay the money back.
He does, because someone gave him the money.
Huh?
Someone gave him the money, so of course he has to pay back.
Who gave him the money? Not my bit. In my scenario, nobody gave him the money.
He said he borrowed money.
He spent it.
Hey,
Oh, sorry. Usually when you borrow money, you don't borrow money to put it in the bank and then wait till the time's up and pay it back. You borrow money to spend it. Right? But he assumes he has a good job, he's making money, has a house if necessary, he'll sell the house. He has ways to pay it back if necessary. And now he's lost all those resources. Of course, he spent the money that he borrowed. So now that's one possibility. If he can't pay it back, he doesn't owe it. It's not obligated. If and when he'll get money, he'll have to pay it. But in the meantime, right now, he has no obligation to pay it back. That's one point of view. The other point of view is he has an obligation to pay it back. He ought to pay it back. It's just that when June 1st goes by and he doesn't show up with the money, we don't blame him. We won't penalize him. We won't criticize him because it's become impossible for him to pay. Now, what would be the practical difference between those two? Well, the practical difference might be for me. I'm looking at Richard, poor Richard. Yeah, I'm quoting Dickens. Poor Richard. And Richard can't pay. I have spare cash. Should I lend Richard money to pay off the debt? Is there any moral sense to my lending Richard money to pay off the debt or not? I think the answer to that question will depend upon which view you have. If you say that right now Richard has no obligation to pay, it is not true that he ought to pay, why then should I lend him the money? What would I be accomplishing? What kind of morality would I be serving lending him the money? True, if I lend him the money, then I will make him obligated, but is there any moral rule to make people obligated to do things? Does morality ask me, praise me for making people obligated to do things which without me they're not obligated to do? That's not obvious. Right now he's free and clear. There's no moral gain in my lending the money to pay it back, since right now he has no obligation to pay. But if you take the second point of view, then he has an obligation to pay. He ought to pay. When he doesn't pay, he's failing in an obligation. There's a moral loss here. The world is morally bad or morally worse because he's not fulfilling his obligation. It's just that we can't blame him. Can't blame him. Can't penalize him because he's incapable of doing anything about it. Then I could say to myself, look, there's a human being who's not living up to his obligations. And I can arrange that he should live up to his obligations. I can lend him the money, open-ended. I have the spare cash. And then he can fulfill his obligation to pay the debt. Then I think there's a moral incentive for me to do that. Because I make the world a better place. As it is now, a person is failing to live up to his obligation, and I can take away that moral loss by lending him the money. Then I ought to do that. I think that's one difference between the first view and the second view. Are we clear so far? Okay, now, in Jewish law, when someone has an obligation, he's not able to fulfill it, it is a positive mitzvah for anyone else who can help him do it, to help him do it. We don't say, well, since he can't do it, he's not obligated. No, what we say is, even if he can't do it, he is obligated, he ought to do it, he's just not penalized for failure. So, there was a time, 100 years ago, and 50 years ago in Europe, around Sukkot time, especially in Northern Europe and Poland, where getting a lulav and esrog was very, very difficult. They don't grow in those areas, and if they were growing in those areas, they'd be dead by then because the ground is covered with snow, they're all withered. If they shipped them in from someplace else, they're quite expensive. I have a lulav and esrog. Other people don't. Since they don't have and they can't get, according to the first view, they have no obligation to do that mitzvah.
Yeah, but I'm obligated to help them do it.
Only if they have an obligation to do it.
Then the Jews also.
But if they're not obligated to do it, why should I be obligated to help them? A person has to give 10% on his income to charity. Okay? He's going through the month, and he's earned his money, and he's given 10%. He's finished. He's finished his charity obligation for the month. Should I give him $10,000 so he'll give another $1,000 to charity? Why would I do that? Why would I do that? What for? What would he gain? How would the world be a better place? He's fulfilled his obligation to charity. Nothing else he has to do. If I give him $10,000, then he's got to give another $1,000 to charity. That's true, but what point is there in doing that? Morality doesn't gain anything from that. The world doesn't become a better place when I give him $10,000, he gives another $1,000 to charity. Here too, if a person doesn't have a lulav and esrog, if you think he has no obligation, why should I lend him mine? What for? Because when I lend him mine, I create an obligation for him? Who says that morality cares about creating obligations for people? Why should I do that? But if he has an obligation to take lulav and esrog, he does have an obligation. Just since he doesn't have one, he won't be penalized for failure. If I lend him mine, I'm helping him fulfill his obligation. That's making the world morally a better place, because he's now fulfilled an obligation that otherwise he would have failed to fulfill. So the Jewish point of view is that you are obligated to do all of the 613 commandments perfectly. That's what you're obligated to do. It's just that when that obligation runs up against your finite resources, finite abilities, finite strength, and you fail to live up to some parts of that obligation, if you can honestly say, I didn't fulfill those, and I failed to fulfill those because they're beyond my capacity, then you have no penalty. But the obligation is there. Are we together so far? Okay. Now, given that, I want to distinguish between standards and ideals in those terms. A standard is something which I have an obligation to fulfill. Something that's binding on me now. True, there might be cases where I don't live up to standards, and maybe cases where I'm not able to live up to standards, but I'm obligated to do that. If I don't, I failed. I might have failed because I wasn't able to do better. And therefore I don't get blamed or penalized for the failure, but a failure it is. And that would mean that other people have a moral incentive to help me live up to the standards, because the world is the worst place when I'm violating standards. That's how I want to describe a standard. A standard is something that I have an obligation to live up to now. And that's precisely what an ideal is not. An ideal is not something that I have an obligation to live up to. Not because it's impossible. That's not the issue. Some standards I have an obligation to live up to, and I'm not. It's not possible for me. It's not because it's impossible. But the purpose of an ideal is to inspire a person to grow in that direction, to try to become more and more in tune with the ideal. The purpose of that ideal is not to regulate my behavior 100% now. It's something that I should strive to improve in approaching. I think a healthy person in any area of life, and certainly in our area of life, needs both. A person needs standards and a person needs ideals. A person needs standards because, in fact, there are binding obligations. There are binding minimums that if a person doesn't recognize that, then he's just morally unrealistic. And they're pretty well agreed upon, what those binding minimums are, given my position that you're obligated even if you can't live up to it. You shouldn't steal. You shouldn't steal, you shouldn't damage other people's property, you should save people in danger, insofar as you can without endangering yourself. Help people in various ways. You should try to behave in a just, fair manner, promote justice and fairness in society. These are things that are obligations because they're standards. A person who fails to do that feels bad and knows there's an urgency about doing better because he's violating an obligation. When it comes to ideals, that's what guides one's surplus energy, one's surplus creativity for growth above and beyond the standards, the minimum standards that one has for life. I think compassion, sympathy, where I identify with a person and I feel what he's feeling. The Torah talks about charity and has two verses. One verse is, don't tighten your fist, and the other verse is, don't harden your heart. So the commentators ask, if you've already been told not to tighten your fist, that means give money. Why does it also say, don't harden your heart? And they say, it's not enough to give money. That's not enough. You have to feel the pain of the person who's asking for money. You have to know it's hard for him. It's embarrassing for him. You have to sympathize, and you have to treat him in a way that's sensitive to his pain. What some people do even today, it was more common, I think, in Yerushalayim of 100 years ago, but even today, when a person asks for charity and they give him charity, they say, thank you for providing me with the opportunity to do the mitzvah of charity. Meaning, not only am I giving you something, but you're giving me something. Indeed, what you're giving me is more precious than what I'm giving you. I'm giving you money, and you've given me the opportunity to do a mitzvah. Mitzvah is worth more than the money. So in this little transaction where I give you money, I'm getting more than you're getting. Yeah.
Sorry, doesn't it come off a bit rude saying that?
Sorry, say again?
Doesn't it come off a bit rude, like the person's pleading and say, I have no money, and you saying, thank you so much that you're making me be able to do this mitzvah.
Yes.
So in some way, you're justifying that they're poor, so you're just like reiterating it to them and like making a statement. I know what you're doing is a good mitzvah, but in some way you're making them feel bad about themselves.
I don't think that's right, and I think maybe you're conflating two ideas that really should be separated. To imply that his being poor is okay, maybe with the background that if he's poor, it must be God who made him poor. If God made him poor, then it must be okay that he's poor because God does that, and God does it's right. But then the conclusion from that is I shouldn't give him charity. Because if it's really right that he should be poor, who am I to disturb what God set up? If God wants him rich, let God make him rich. That's what a Roman challenged Rabbi Akiva with. If your God loves the poor so much, let him take care of them. Why do I have to take care of them? The answer is, when I give him charity, what I'm saying is, you shouldn't be poor. It's not right that you're poor. If it were right that you were poor, I wouldn't give you charity. I would leave you where it's right. No, I'm giving you charity to get you out of poverty, insofar as I can, insofar as I have my responsibilities of distributing my charity money are concerned. And then I say to him, but I don't want you to think that in this transaction, you're taking and I'm giving, so I'm better than you, I'm superior to you. I want you to know that you're giving me something precious also, because you're making it possible for me to do the mitzvah of charity. A poor person who hears that feels, so I'm not just a drain. I'm not just a sink for other people's kindness. I'm also doing something for somebody else. I think that's very important to build the poor person. There were poor people, the commentators tell us, who didn't take money all year long. They had their way of doing things without taking money. Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, they did take money in order to give the mitzvah of charity to others who were worried about their judgment before God. They wanted them to have an extra minute. They were mitzvah. They were willing to take money. So they really aren't doing it for the sake of the other person's mitzvah. If I say to a poor person, I thank you for the fact that you gave me the opportunity to do this mitzvah. When you say thank you to somebody, you make them feel good. You don't make them feel bad. When you say thank you to somebody, you're building him up. You're not pushing him down. This is a classical Jewish idea that you recognize that he's also got something to give. He's also got something valuable. He's also providing an opportunity. This is the idea that when you fail to live up to an obligation, that's a failure, and it's something which you need to have as a bottom line. And ideals are something that you grow towards, something to inspire further growth. Now, are we together so far?
There's two things that it says in the Torah. Those are both standards?
No.
Oh,
The standard is something that I have an obligation to live up to now. If I fail to live up to that, I'm failing.
How do we give charity?
So now, let's see. If he asks me for charity,
Close your fist. That would be a standard, right?
yes, I have to. There's a certain amount of money that I'm obligated to give. I must give it. If I don't give it, then I'm definitely failing.
The other one would be
But let's say compassion. So compassion is where I have to feel what he feels, and that's without end, really. There are people who perform the compassion in very dramatic ways. A person would come in and they would cry with him. Because I said, please tell me what you're collecting for. Tell me how long you've been collecting. Tell me how hard it is. And they would cry with him. And then, and feed him. You must be hungry. You must be thirsty. There's no limit to what you can do other than just hand out money. Now, the question then becomes this. Given that the standards I'm obligated to right now, and the ideas are just a matter, that's giving it away, sort of, they're a matter of further growth. If I'm not living up to my standards right now, should I put all of my effort into living up to my standards, fulfilling my obligations, before I start working on also growing towards my ideals? In terms of the importance of each one, defined the way I've defined them, that seems to be almost inescapable. If you have a person who's a kleptomaniac, he's stealing. Okay, he's out of control. I mean, I don't know too much about the psychology. So if I'm not getting psychology right, then pretend. I'm just talking about this as an example. What I learned 100 years ago is that a kleptomaniac is someone's out of control. He has to steal. He can't help it. So he's stealing other people's stuff. That's terrible. It's a crime. Something he's obligated not to do. Now, one might say, well, work on that. Get help. Get some kind of counseling. One way you think you can stop kleptomania cold is simply hire somebody to walk around with the guy who watches hands. He's not going to steal when somebody's watching him. He's going to ring the bell right away so he won't get away with it. Part of the thrill of kleptomania is that I can get away with it. I can fool them, outsmart them, and get away with it. If he knows he can't get away with it, it doesn't happen. So the first thing we'll say is, you're stealing other people's property. You've got to stop that. What? Grow in terms of your ideals of compassion or whatever else it is? Not at the expense of taking other people's property. So the first thought is, standards are really binding. They're binding immediately. Ideals would be only for someone who's already living up to all his standards. Golly, I think that would mean that ideals are going to be quite rare. Quite rare. Everyone, a person who's living up to all of his standards, never fails to live up to his standards. I think that's not common. I think there's a countervailing thought, a thought on the other side, which has to be taken into account. How to work them out in detail, I'm not sure, but I think there's a countervailing thought on the other side. There's something impoverished about a person who only works on living up to his obligations. There's something impoverished in that. The idea of going beyond yourself, the idea of going beyond what you're absolutely obligated to do, is a necessary part of a morally and spiritually healthy person. The ability to make a gesture above and beyond. I owe money to benefactors, and I have to pay it back. Can I buy a gift for my wife? Or should we say, you borrowed money. Pay back the money you owe. What do you mean buying a gift for your wife? The other thought is, no, part of life is stepping beyond yourself. Part of life is going beyond what you are recognize you are obligated to do, that you must do, that you ought to do. And if that part of you isn't given expression, then there's something spiritually impoverished about your performance. This question is mirrored within Jewish law. We have two Jewish laws which mirror this distinction that I've been making all the way through, which are categories that are recognized and discussed in those terms precisely. There are mitzvahs which are called mitzvah v'osa. You are obligated to perform the mitzvah. God said, do X. Do X. I'm ordering you to do X. If you do X, you'll be rewarded. If you don't do X, you'll be punished. It's an obligatory mitzvah. Then there are voluntary mitzvahs. Voluntary mitzvahs, where God says, I invite you to do X. I'm not ordering you, I'm not obligating you, I'm inviting you. If you do X, you'll be rewarded, but if you don't do X, you won't be punished. I'm allowing you to omit it if you like. I'm just inviting you to do it, and if you do it, you'll be rewarded. There are mitzvos of both kinds. I'll give you an example. There's a mitzvah during Sukkot to live in the sukkah. Dwell in the sukkah, make the sukkah your home. All sleep must be in the sukkah. All sleep. Not even a 10-second cat nap are you allowed to take outside the sukkah. Eating, major meals have to be eaten in the sukkah. Major meals means bread or large quantities of cake and other baked goods. Some say wine, but meat and vegetables and cheese and milk, fruits, all that can be eaten outside the sukkah. You're not obligated to eat that in the sukkah. However, if you go into the sukkah to eat them, you make a blessing on the mitzvah of sukkah. So when you go in to eat meat and vegetables and fruit or cheese, you're doing the mitzvah of sukkah. You're just not obligated to do it. It's a voluntary mitzvah. Now the mitzvah of sukkah is set up in two tiers, the obligatory and the voluntary. If a Kodesh Baruch Hu creates a voluntary mitzvah, that means he sees a value in that mitzvah being voluntary. It's not just a throwaway. That there are these two levels of mitzvah. We're coming to Hanukkah. The Neiros Hanukkah have three levels. They're the only mitzvah in the Torah. This is rabbinic, but it's the only mitzvah that we have in the entire Jewish tradition that has three levels. There's the Ber mitzvah, which is one candle per house per night. For the whole household, 8 candles for the entirety of Sukkot. Then there are two ways to extend it. One is that each person should light his own. And the other is that each night you should add an extra candle. Ashkenazim and Sephardim disagree on which is the order of extension. So one is the minimum mitzvah, the next one is called Mahadrin, and the next one is called Mahadrin min Mahadrin. Mahadrin means to do things in a superior fashion. So there's the minimum, superior, and superiorest, the greatest superior. And the mitzvah is set up in that way. Why is the mitzvah set up in that way? Because you know the story. They found one container of pure oil. They put it in the menorah, and it burned for 8 nights. After 8 nights, they had new supplies of pure oil. Let me ask you a question, just an informational question. Suppose they had found no pure oil. What would they have done? They would have lit impure oil. Impure oil is permissible when you have no pure oil. Tu mahutra b'tzibur. All impure objects, quantities, even if the person is impure, there's no way of doing it in purity, then you do it with impurity. So when God made the miracle of finding, that's right, well, he made a double miracle, finding the one container of oil, making it burn for 8 days, he didn't do that to make lighting the menorah possible. He did that to make lighting the menorah ideal. Not possible, but ideal. So the rabbis, when they set up the mitzvah, said we have to reflect that. We have to reflect the idea that there's the minimum and the ideal. But many mitzvahs have 2 levels. Many mitzvahs have a minimum level and a better level. So in order to make the mitzvah of Hanukkah picture this concept of ideal in a way that's related to Hanukkah, they made 3 levels. No other mitzvah has 3 levels. There's only 2 levels. But here the Torah is telling us, and today, I don't know how difficult it was 2,000 years ago to procure oil or wax, and whether poor people really couldn't do any better. Today, there's no one who can't have everyone light and add the number of candles. Everyone does it that way. And the message is we're striving for that higher ideal. The higher ideal of something which is the best, even though it goes beyond what I'm obligated to do. The Nesiva Shalom, previous Slonim Rabbi, Zechatzaddik Lebracha, put this idea into a spiritual and psychological context. Let's imagine a person who lives up to his standards. recognizes standards, lives up to them faithfully. And sometimes it's hard, and he works on it, and he produces and succeeds. How should we picture his mental state? How should we picture his moral fiber or his moral character? I think we could say that he's responsible. He's dutiful. He recognizes obligations and fulfills them. That could be the total mental state of a person who fulfills the standards. What's the mental state of a person who also lives in terms of ideals, who goes beyond the minimum standards? That can't just be responsibility and duty, because he's not responsible to do those things. He has no duty to do those things. That's an expression of love, where I go beyond what I'm required to do. I can only show that I love you if I do something for you that I'm not obligated to do. If you work for me and we have a contract, and behind the contract I owe you $2,000, when I hand you the $2,000, that's not an act of love. You don't see any love in that. I have to give it to you. I'm obligated to give it to you. By law, I have to give it. If I don't give it, you can sue me. That's not love. Love is only when I give you something that I don't owe you. I'm not obligated to give you. So God sets up obligations, absolute duties, and then he sets up opportunities to go beyond the absolute obligations and duties, where you can express love for God. Love for God is one of the mitzvahs also. So God gives us an opportunity to express it. That means that going beyond the minimum standards is it's a important part of serving God. Serving God is not enough just to live up to the minimum standards. Now, we do have a rule that if it's a conflict between two mitzvos, one is obligatory, you have to do it, it's a duty, an obligation, and the other is voluntary, and there's a conflict between the two of them, I think in every case we are required to do the obligatory one and not the voluntary one. So, in terms of priority, in a conflict situation, the obligatory ones take precedence, and that goes along with the first intuition we said. Look, this I have to do. I'm obligated to do this. What do you mean I'm going to violate an obligation so as to strive for an ideal? Mapitom. Who gives you permission to do that? But there are times when no obligatory mitzvah is binding on you, and where you have room and time for voluntary mitzvahs. And then adding voluntary mitzvahs to your repertoire is an important aspect of expressing love of God. There's a phrase which comes up in the Tanakh many times, chesed ve'emes. Chesed means loving kindness, and emes means that which is absolutely real. I know emes is translated as truth, but it's not really correct. That's a long story, it's a whole shir, I'm not going to do it now, I'm just telling you the truth. That emes doesn't mean true, it means that which is absolutely real. Absolutely real. The Gaon of Vilna asks, why do these two words come together so often? Throughout the Tanakh, you have them over and over again together. And he says, because a person who dedicates himself to one is very likely to give himself leave not to live up to the other perfectly. A person who's working on his obligations, and he succeeds in fulfilling all his obligations, he says, I'm doing everything that's required, everything, perfectly. Want me to go beyond also? Do extra also? Mapito. These are the things that are really important, things that are binding, and I'm succeeding in doing them. Don't ask anything else from me. The other, which is even worse, is a person who says, look how much extra I'm doing over here. I'm doing so much extra here. Surely I should have some leeway in not living up to that obligation, in not fulfilling that obligation, because look at all the extra that I'm doing over here. The Gaon says, of course, neither of those is appropriate. Neither is appropriate as a stopping place and saying what I'm doing is okay. Pure emes is not appropriate because you have to go beyond yourself also. And chesed, to the extreme in one area, does not justify violating a standard in another area. One needs to work that both of them should be in place, and even if one has not yet fulfilled all of the obligatory, there is room for some expression of the voluntary, so that the quality of love of God will be in place. Okay? Want to get that so far? Now, the choice of ideals, there's actually a verse in the Torah which talks about this. It's Kedoshim Tihiyu. Ramban puts that verse, Kedoshim Tihiyu means be holy. And there's another verse in Deuteronomy, that's in Vayikra, in Leviticus. In Deuteronomy it says, V'yasisa yashav atov b'nei Hashem. Do that which is straight and good in God's eyes. On both of those verses, Nachmanides has a commentary, and he cross-references the two commentaries. Do what is straight and good in God's eyes. My, what might that be? There are a lot of mitzvahs out there. A lot of mitzvahs involving interpersonal obligations. Is this another one? Is this mitzvah 614? Probably not. So then what is it? It's just redundant? It means do what is straight and good. It's just another way of saying do all the other mitzvahs. The man says no. And he says something that's a bit surprising, maybe even shocking. He says, it is impossible to write down all of the rules for governing interpersonal behavior. It's impossible to write down a full list of all the rules governing how you should behave with other people. Friends, associates, family, society. It's impossible. Now, let's just pause and take note. This book is written by God. So Ramban is saying it's impossible for God to write down a complete list of rules governing interpersonal behavior. I think what he means is God could write it down, but it'd be 1 trillion pages long. What could that do us? He couldn't write it for us. We wouldn't be able to guide our behavior on the basis of all the rules that are necessary. So, says the Ramban, God operates with a double policy. Some rules he gives us explicitly, literally, precisely, in detail. And then he says, don't be satisfied merely with the exact rules that I gave you. Strive to go beyond the rules that I gave you to do what is right and good in God's eyes. Straight and good in God's eyes. What might that be? So that's a whole story, how you know what that is and how the rabbis knew. But there's a responsibility to go beyond what the exact laws say. I'll give you an example of one. I'm selling a field. I have to put it out for bids, and I'll sell it to the highest bidder. I get 2 equal bids. I can flip a coin. But it turns out that one bidder has his home and his home field 5 miles away. And the other bidder has his home and his home field adjacent to mine. Then I must sell it to the second buyer. Because it's much more efficient for him, much more useful to him. The rabbis pushed this law so strictly, this is unbelievable. They said, if I sell it to the guy 5 miles away, when the guy 5 miles away pays the money, it becomes the land of the guy next door. He's forced into acting as an agent for the guy next door. Of course, the guy next door should pay him back his money. But he can't buy it. He can't buy it. Now, that's not written anywhere. Moses didn't command that. The rabbis said we have to do what's straight and right. Here, the added benefit to the guy next door can't be overlooked. It can't be overlooked. I get the same sale price, but the benefit to the buyer is much bigger in this case. I have no right to sacrifice that. There's endless refinements on how you can treat other people, and the Torah requires us to go beyond what the written law tells us. And in Kedoshim Tihiyu, the Ramban makes the same remark about personal life. It says the laws of personal life do not exhaust how a person should live his life. For example, he says, we have laws of kashrus. Certain things you can eat, certain things you can't eat, the ways you have to prepare them, combinations. What is to stop a person from getting 100% kalat kosher badatz meat and 100% kosher badatz wine and eating and drinking himself into a stupor? Where in the laws of kashrus to say not to do that? Says the Ramban, that's Kedoshim Tihiyu. Be holy. Infuse your life with holiness above and beyond the strict, exact laws that bind you as standards, as minimum obligations. requirements, duties. The Ramban says we have this responsibility in both personal life and in interpersonal life. Now, how do I do that? How do I know which way to go, which way to grow? Here it's individual. Each person is different. Each person is different. Some people have natural sensitivities, natural gifts, natural talents. Use them. Start there. Grow in the directions that are easy for you, that are natural for you. Then you can think about growing in other ways. Everyone should be involved in a process of personal growth, above and beyond the obligatory. Yes, individually, there's a conflict between obligatory and voluntary. Obligatory takes precedence. But it's a necessary part of a person's spiritual life to be also involved in the growth beyond the absolutely obligatory. That's what those two verses describe. Now, when I say that it's personal, individual, that means it's a matter of judgment, a matter of thinking about your life and your abilities, your capabilities, where you're going, where you're likely to go, and making a choice. These things, as I've told some of you before, require a good amount of self-knowledge, self-understanding. That's not easy to achieve, and that's where a person could use advice of friends, advice of mentors. Mentioning mentors up until about 15 years ago always used to get me in trouble. What do you mean a mentor? Aren't you living your own life? What are you, a robot? Can't you make your own decisions? But now, with the new respected profession of life coaching, I guess people have come to realize that, yeah, I might make my own decisions, but I might botch them also. I might make very bad decisions. And to take advice from someone who's older than I am, knows more than I am, who has more understanding and sensitivity, or can simply enable me to overcome my bias, my prejudice in my own case, that's very valuable. So if a person's thinking about which way he should try to grow and extend himself, that's something which requires profound self-knowledge, going to vary from person to person. We have a great example of this in the patriarchs. The patriarchs lived according to the commandments of the Torah, even though they weren't commanded. They were not obligated. God didn't command them. He merely informed them that these will be the standards by which their descendants will live. These will be revealed to their descendants later in history, and they chose to perform them on their own. Because they said, living up to the 7 categories of Noahide laws, not 7 laws, the 7 categories, about 65, is not enough. It's not enough. My soul wants to push beyond that. It wants to develop beyond that. Indeed, this desire and this practice on their part led to a famous inquiry. Okay, so Abraham kept kosher, and he gave charity, and he practiced kashrus, and so forth and so on. What about bris milah? Circumcision. We know he didn't do that, because we know he was commanded at the age of 99 to do it, and he did it at the age of 99, and thereafter Isaac was born. So he didn't do that one. Why did he do that one? Why did he put that one off? So given what I told you, you could cook up an answer. Yeah.
If you make the covenant with Hashem, now you're obligated to do all those mitzvahs. They're no longer ideals, they're obligations.
Even after he has the bris milah, he's not obligated to keep kosher. That doesn't change. That doesn't change. But you're going in the right direction. Going in the right direction, you just spread it too wide. Try again. What's the difference between kosher, charity, prayer, and circumcision? It's a gigantic difference between circumcision on the one hand and all those other mitzvahs on the other hand. Say again? Permanent, okay, I guess that's the right idea. I wouldn't use that word. It's,
Circumcision it brings you into the covenant.
yeah, no, but that's not the point here. The point here is you can only do it once. You can only do it once. It's permanent means that once it's done, it's done. Okay, now look at the gigantic difference. I prayed today. I'm praying voluntarily. I'm not required to pray. If prayer will become obligatory tomorrow, so then I'll pray tomorrow, obligatorily. I didn't lose anything by praying today. Today's not going to come back. But Mila, if he does Mila voluntarily, he's lost out on the possibility of doing it obligatorily. And the doing it as an obligation is a much bigger mitzvah. That's one of the reasons they say he held back. He wanted to wait till it was obligatory, so that then it will have the major status of fulfilling an obligation rather than the status of being something voluntary. But you see from the very fact that they volunteered to do the mitzvos, that they felt this level is a level that's crucial to a complete spirituality, that it has to be there for the person. So as one studies the Torah and as one works on improving one's compliance with the Torah, some part should be reserved for going beyond what you're absolutely obligated to do. I have a suggestion for one type of thing to do, which I think is spiritually very, very fruitful. Many people ask, how can I develop a relationship with God? How can I feel connected to God? Here's one suggestion. It's a good question. You should ask it of other people as well. But one suggestion that I have is this. Try to do a mitzvah that nobody knows about but you and God. Nobody else knows about. Won't add to your reputation. Won't add to the way people look at you. Just you and God. When you do something privately, just between you and God, then you feel connected. Whereas if other people are looking, the fact that your motivation is diluted means that it doesn't give you that sense of connection. So, give charity when no one sees you give charity. Or when you're walking and you see someone who's asking for charity, doesn't know you, you don't know them, you'll never see them again. That's pretty close to anonymous. Or you're in the base medrash and nobody's around and some books are out, put the books away. Or when you see the lights on in this room and there's nobody here, turn the lights off. Save the yeshiva some money. Something like that. And you have a laundry here. I remember when I was dorming and did laundry, you often come, you've done your wash, somebody else's clothes are in the dryer, and you want to use the dryer, so it's customary. Take the guy's clothes out of the dryer, put them in a basket, and put your clothes in the dryer. His clothes have dried already, so nothing wrong with that. Fold his clothes. Fold his clothes. You walk away, he'll come back and find his basket of clothes folded. He won't know that it's you. He's not going to know who came after him to do the wash. Try to do something, if you can, some mitzvah that nobody knows about. Do that, then something that you and only God know. Here's another way. This I have from my youngest son. We talk about learning Torah Lishma, learning Torah as a mitzvah for God, not for any other reason. Subject that should be discussed more. And one of the things he suggested is this. You're learning something with your charusa, with your study partner. And it's difficult, as it often is. And you bat it around, you don't get an answer. That night, you're thinking it over. And the answer hits you. Bang! I've got it! I know the answer! Come in tomorrow and say, wow, listen to this, I've got the answer, here it is. No, don't do that. Say, you know what someone told me? You know what someone told me? He told me this was the answer. That way you don't take credit for it. You don't take credit for it. You're not beating your chest and saying how great I am. Now, nobody knows that but you and God, because you really did think it up. But you know that you're not taking credit for it. That's the way to do a mitzvah between you and God. When you do a mitzvah that's only between you and God, that's a mitzvah which gives you the sense of connection. And I don't know of any requirement to do mitzvahs like that. This is an obligation or a standard to do mitzvahs like that. It's something extra. It's a step beyond. But it's a very fruitful step beyond in spiritual terms. Anyway, that's what I wanted to tell you about standards and ideals and the relationship they have to personal growth. Any questions? Yeah.
So
Sfarim would say the Chavis Chaim, Shemar Salashon, or Sefer Chavis Chaim, like these are halachas that come from the Torah itself, or are they just as it standards, or are those, I'm understanding that. Is there a source for each and every halacha that he says? In the
Yes, there's a source for each and every halacha. It's interesting that you asked that. I'm not fluent in all the laws of Lashon Hara, but I think, my guess is that they're all obligatory. They're all obligatory. I don't know if any that says, well, it's okay if you don't do this, but if you do it, it's praiseworthy. In Lashon Hara? I'm not aware of any, but the person you should ask that of is Rabbi Samet. Rabbi Samet is an expert of the law of Lashon Hara, and he and his wife wrote a sefer about it, and I think you should ask him. It's a nice question. It's a nice question. I don't know of any area of anything there that's voluntary. It's all obligatory.